go through each of these forgotten American heroes, each one by one, and you can tell me your thoughts and some of your takeaways from each in their life story. So first up, we have Elizabeth Freeman, and you have the floor.
The biggest takeaway from her story for me is it shows you that in the very beginning of the founding of this country, the seeds were sown about the doubt and the travesty of slavery. You hear the left going about now, America was always slavery, America was always, no, it wasn't. In the very founding documents, and I'm not even talking about the Declaration of Independence in the Constitution, but going backwards into the Massachusetts Constitution. In the arguments at the time that were being made in court, she was able to say, wait a second, if this freedom exists for all men, by the way, she was woman, right? If it exists for all men, doesn't exist for me. And the white judges agreed with her. This shows you that from the very beginning, despite slavery's existence, the doubt was there. And many Americans, indeed governing Americans, already knew this was wrong and it was on its way out.
And of course, talking about slavery, next we have James Armistead Lafayette. He was a slave at the time when the Revolutionary War broke out. The Brits were trying to bring over some American slaves by saying, we'll grant you freedom if you fight for us against the American colonists. And yet James looks at them and he says, no, instead I'm going to work for the Americans, work for the colonists, and work for my freedom that way. Tell me a little bit about him as well.
His story is particularly interesting because at the time he stood up to defend against the British soldiers who were pushing and trying to bully someone in the street, he knew at that moment he could get caught. Freedom was so important to him, and I think we missed that. Freedom as a concept of a nation, as America, was so important to him that at the time he risked getting caught and being drugged back into slavery to stand up for American ideals. That to me is actually absolutely amazing, right? He loved this country so much that that's what he was willing to do. He was willing to risk it all for this country. And by the way, all three of these people fall in the same camp. It's across the board. And the really remarkable thing is he didn't talk about how horrible America was. Him of all people, when he was denied, right? When Armistead was denied his freedom by Virginia, he could have came back and said, this country is horrible. This country. No, what did he do? He stepped up and said, I'm going to continue to fight for what you promised me. And he won it. That to me is America. I don't even know if I could do that now.
Yeah, he's definitely a great man. And of course, now we also have Crispus Attucks, a more household name out of the three, I would say. A lot more Americans know about him. He's seen as a martyr. Yeah. He's the first known casualty of the American Revolutionary War. Tell me a little bit more about him as well.
Also stood up against, he's the best known that stood up against British soldiers, risked his life to be, again, drugged back into slavery. And for him, it was no thought. For him, it was no thought. And he died because of it. From the very beginning, people like Atticus, like you said, the more well-known one, and Freeman, for example, Armistead, from the very beginning, these men and women of color, as the left would like to say, former slaves, in some cases current and escaped slaves, were willing to stand up for an ideal they knew that the country wasn't living up to. This is what's remarkable, that the concept of freedom and liberty was so great that they would risk getting drugged back into slavery. And then if they're drugged back, imagine how they're going to be treated once they had stood up and embarrassed their former owners. They risked doing all of that because they understood America has this right idea. And if we can get America to fully practice it, it'll be the greatest country on earth. And that's what's indeed happened today. Imagine if Republicans now in Congress could stand up for what they believe in. All we're asking them to do is to risk a little bit of less money, risk maybe not getting voted in office again. Republicans now need to learn from these three former slaves. Stand up and it can be yours. Fight for the people.